David sat at the kitchen table, watching Julia move around the room with an energy he hadn't seen in years. She spoke animatedly, her hands gesturing as she reenacted a scene from rehearsal. Her face was lit with excitement, her voice filled with the kind of passion that once belonged to their late-night conversations. And then Eric told me, "Acting is all about truth, Julia. You have to feel it deep in your bones." She smiled, shaking her head, as if the words had completely transformed her. David smiled, though something about the way she spoke made his stomach tighten. "It sounds like you're really enjoying this," he said, reaching for his glass of wine. "Maybe I should come watch a rehearsal sometime." Julia hesitated, just for a second, but he caught it. Then she laughed lightly, brushing the suggestion away. "Oh, David, it's not that exciting yet. We're still just doing exercises, warming up. It's all pretty raw right now. I'd rather you see the finished product, you know." He nodded, forcing a chuckle. "I guess I'll have to wait for opening night then." She leaned over, kissing his cheek. "Exactly. You'll love it, I promise." David wanted to believe her, and maybe a year ago, he wouldn't have thought twice about it. But something didn't sit right. Julia had never expressed an interest in theater before. Sure, she enjoyed movies, and they'd been to a few plays together over the years, but this sudden passion felt off. It wasn't just the way she spoke about acting, it was how she spoke about him. Eric. The name had been slipping into conversation more and more often. At first it was natural. He was the director of the local community theater group. He was experienced, talented, a mentor. But lately, it felt like every story she told had his name in it. Eric says this, Eric thinks that. Eric believes I have real talent. David pushed the thoughts aside, unwilling to let paranoia take root. Julia had never given him a reason to doubt her. But still, over the next few weeks, little things began to stand out. She was gone more often. Longer rehearsals, late nights. She started dressing differently, wearing makeup even when she swore she was just running to the theater. When she came home, she smelled faintly of expensive cologne, a scent that didn't belong to him. Then there were the lies. Small ones at first. I grabbed a quick bite with the girls after rehearsal, but when he casually mentioned it to one of her friends, she'd frowned. I haven't seen Julia all week. David's stomach twisted. He tried to brush it off, telling himself there had to be an explanation, but deep down, a quiet gnawing voice whispered the truth. Something wasn't right, and he was going to find out exactly what Julia was hiding. David had never considered himself a suspicious man. He had always trusted Julia, trusted their marriage, their history. But as the weeks passed, his gut refused to quiet down. It wasn't just her late nights or the evasive answers anymore. It was the way she had begun to look at him, like she was performing, smiling too brightly, speaking too carefully, as if she had rehearsed every conversation before stepping through the front door. He told himself he was being paranoid. He told himself that Julia was simply excited about something new, about finding a passion outside of their marriage. But doubt had a way of creeping in, settling into the quiet moments when she wasn't there. It was there when he sat alone at dinner, pushing food around his plate. It was there when he rolled over in bed and found her side empty, still cold. And it was there when he opened her messages one evening while she was in the shower and saw Eric's name more times than his own. She had stopped leaving her phone unattended lately. That night, when she rushed to grab it from the nightstand before stepping into the bathroom, he knew. His hands tightened into fists, but he forced himself to exhale, to stay calm. He wasn't going to accuse her. Not yet. He needed proof. So when Julia casually mentioned another late rehearsal on Wednesday, David decided it was time. He left work early that evening, his heart pounding in his chest as he drove to the small theater where Julia claimed to be rehearsing. He parked across the street and sat for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, telling himself that he would probably feel ridiculous in 5 minutes when he walked inside and found her practicing monologues. But when he stepped out of his car and approached the entrance, dread curled in his stomach. The place was dark. No lights from inside, no voices, no movement. He tried the door, but it was locked. His fingers hovered over his phone. He could call her, ask where she was, catch her in a lie, but something held him back. Instead, he pulled out his own phone and checked her location. His breath caught in his throat. She wasn't at the theater, she was across town, at Bellamy's, a high-end restaurant where they had celebrated anniversaries, birthdays, and promotions. A place where Julia only ever wanted to go for special occasions. A slow, sickening realization washed over him. His hands felt numb as he climbed back into his car, gripping the wheel like it was the only thing keeping him tethered to reality. This was it. The moment he had been dreading. The moment he had been trying to convince himself would never come. The drive to Bellamy's felt both endless and instant, his thoughts racing too fast to grasp. By the time he pulled into the parking lot, he was running on pure adrenaline. He stepped out, adjusting his jacket, trying to steady himself before walking in. The restaurant was warm, glowing with candlelight, filled with the soft murmur of conversation and the gentle clinking of wine glasses. He scanned the room, barely breathing, until his eyes landed on her, Julia. She was sitting near the window, her back straight, her head tilted slightly as she listened intently. Across from her sat him. David had seen photos of him before. A charming, confident man with just enough gray at his temples to give him an air of sophistication. He leaned in, speaking in low tones, his expression amused, his fingers casually wrapped around the stem of his wine glass. Julia was laughing. Her eyes sparkled. Her shoulders relaxed in a way they never did at home anymore. David felt his heart hammer against his ribs. He could hear the blood rushing in his ears, drowning out the sounds of the restaurant. She looked happy. Not just happy, comfortable, intimate. She wasn't a woman nervously meeting with her director to discuss a play. She was a woman on a date. David didn't move for a long moment. He just stood there, watching, letting the scene sink in. The soft glow of candlelight on her face. The way her hand casually rested on the table, so close to Eric's. The way she leaned in slightly, as if drawn to him. She thought she was being discreet. She thought she was untouchable. David clenched his jaw. He could have turned around and walked out. He could have let the shock settle in and gone home, let her return later that night with whatever lies she had rehearsed, but he wasn't going to do that, not this time. His hands felt steady as he took the first step forward. Her act was over, and it was time for the final bow. David moved through the restaurant with slow, deliberate steps, his heartbeat steady despite the storm raging inside him. The soft glow of candlelight illuminated Julia's face as she leaned toward Eric, her lips parted in a smile that once belonged to him. She twirled a strand of hair around her finger, a small, unconscious habit she used when she was utterly engrossed in a conversation. She was comfortable, too comfortable. As he approached the table, Julia let out a soft, melodious laugh, one he hadn't heard in months. David could have stood there longer, let the weight of the moment settle, let her enjoy one last second of pretending. But he didn't. Instead, he stepped up to the table and placed both hands on the smooth white linen, just hard enough to make the glasses tremble. "Hope I'm not interrupting," he said, his voice even, controlled. Julia's head snapped toward him so fast it was almost comical. For a moment she looked at him as if he were a ghost. Like she couldn't believe he was really there, standing inches from the life she had so carefully hidden. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Eric, on the other hand, barely reacted. He took a measured sip of his wine, his eyes flicking up to David's with a look of mild curiosity, like this was a scene he had seen play out before. David let the silence stretch, watching the way Julia's hands twitched in her lap, the way her throat bobbed as she swallowed. "David," she finally breathed, her voice laced with forced calm. What are you doing here?" David leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "I could ask you the same thing, Julia." Her lips trembled before she forced a smile, too bright, too rehearsed. Eric set his glass down with a quiet clink and interjected smoothly, "Julia and I were just discussing the production." He gestured lazily around them. "A little celebratory dinner, you know how it is." David's eyes flicked to him, taking in the self-assured smirk, the way he sat perfectly at ease, like he had nothing to lose. The arrogance of it made David's stomach churn. "Celebratory, huh?" David's gaze drifted back to Julia, whose face was rapidly losing color. "That's funny because I just came from the theater, the one you told me you'd be at." Her mouth opened and closed once, her mind clearly scrambling for a way out. He could see the wheels turning. the calculations running behind her wide, guilty eyes. "David, I was going to tell you." "Tell me what?" He raised an eyebrow. "That your rehearsals are actually candlelit dinners at Bellamy's? That your so-called acting lessons have nothing to do with the stage?" He let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "Come on, Julia. I might have believed it if you weren't here with him." She flinched. Eric, meanwhile, took another sip of wine, utterly unfazed. "David, let's be rational adults here." He leaned back in his chair, his expression infuriatingly smug. "You've clearly misunderstood the situation." David turned to him fully, meeting his gaze without a hint of hesitation. "Oh, I understand perfectly," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I understand that you've been feeding my wife compliments, making her feel special while she lies to me. I understand that she has been sneaking around, pretending she's rehearsing when she's really meeting you. And I understand," he took a slow breath, "that you both thought I was too blind to see it." Julia's fingers gripped the edge of the table like she was holding on for dear life. "David, please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I never meant for—" "Don't." He held up a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "Don't insult me by pretending this was an accident." Her eyes glistened, but whether it was guilt or regret, he couldn't tell, and frankly, he didn't care anymore. "You thought you were playing the role of a lifetime," David continued, his voice hardening. "But I see right through you, Julia. You weren't rehearsing." His lips curled in bitter amusement. "You were performing. For me." Every single day, a tear slipped down her cheek, but David didn't feel the usual ache in his chest at the sight of her sadness. He had spent weeks, maybe months, trying to push his instincts aside, trying to ignore the sinking feeling in his gut. Not anymore. A quiet murmur spread through the restaurant as a few nearby diners began to notice the tension. Julia shifted in her seat, her breath shaky. "Can we talk about this in private?" she pleaded. David shook his head, his decision made. "No, Julia. You didn't give me the courtesy of honesty in private, so why should I do the same for you?" Eric exhaled dramatically, setting his napkin down as if this whole ordeal was beginning to bore him. "David, there's no need to make a scene." David smirked, leaning slightly closer. "Oh, I'm not making a scene, Eric. You two did that all on your own." For the first time, Eric's composure faltered. His smirk faded just a little, and he sat up straighter. Julia wiped at her cheek, her breathing uneven. "David, No," he cut in. "We're done talking. You can go back to your performance now. I hope he gives you the standing ovation you've been craving." With that, David turned on his heel and walked away, leaving Julia sitting there with tears in her eyes, and Eric suddenly looking far less amused. As he stepped out into the crisp night air, a strange sense of relief settled over him. The truth was out. There was no more pretending, and for the first time in months, David no longer felt like a spectator in his own life. Julia's act was over, and he had no interest in watching the encore. David walked out of Bellamy's, his mind buzzing with the confrontation that had just unfolded. The cool night air hit him, but it did nothing to soothe the heat rising in his chest. His hands clenched at his sides as he took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He had expected to feel devastated, but instead, a strange sense of liberation settled over him. The truth was finally out. For weeks, maybe even months, he had been living in the shadow of a suspicion he couldn't prove. Every unanswered question, every odd glance Julia gave him, every moment of hesitation in her voice, he had been gaslighting himself into believing he was imagining it all. But now, standing outside that restaurant, knowing she couldn't lie her way out of this one, David felt something unexpected. Inside Bellamy's, Julia was probably still sitting there, her hands shaking, her face pale. And Eric? David had seen the flicker of discomfort in his eyes before he left, the confidence, the smugness, cracked just enough to show that, despite his efforts to appear unfazed, David's presence had unsettled him. Let them sit in it. David inhaled deeply and exhaled, watching his breath cloud in the night air. He didn't need to yell, didn't need to cause a dramatic scene. His mere presence had been enough. He had caught them, exposed them, and now they had to deal with the fallout. By the time David arrived home, he had already decided he wasn't going to cover for Julia. If she had the audacity to lie to him, to sneak around, then she could deal with the consequences of her own deception. And sure enough, it didn't take long for people to find out. The theater group had its own small but tight-knit community. David had never been deeply involved in it, but he had met some of Julia's castmates at gatherings she had insisted he attend. One of those people, Samantha, texted him the next morning. "Hey David, I don't know if you're okay right now, but I wanted you to know people are talking." David smirked. Of course they were. Word had already begun to spread. The woman who had gushed about her passion for acting, who had told her friends she was finally finding herself, had actually been using rehearsals as an excuse for an affair. It didn't take long for the pieces to fall into place. The canceled rehearsals, the nights she stayed late, the favoritism Eric had shown her. All of it now made perfect sense. By noon, more messages trickled in. I had a feeling something was going on with them. She always talked about Eric like he was some kind of genius. I'm sorry, man. You didn't deserve that. David wasn't sure how much of the humiliation Julia had felt yet, but he imagined it was only just beginning. Later that afternoon, David sat at his desk, sipping coffee, when Julia's name appeared on his phone. Incoming call, Julia. He stared at the screen for a moment before answering, his voice calm. "Yes?" Silence on the other end, then a shaky breath. "David, can we talk?" He leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Talk about what, Julia? How you spent the past few months lying to my face? Or maybe how you humiliated yourself in front of half the theater community?" She let out a quiet sob. I didn't mean for it to happen like this." David laughed, but there was no humor in it. "How did you mean for it to happen, Julia? Were you going to wait until opening night, maybe confess in some dramatic monologue?" She sniffled. "I made a mistake, David. A mistake is forgetting to buy milk," he said coldly. "What you did was calculated." "I miss you," she whispered. "I still love you." David's jaw clenched. He had spent years loving her, believing in her, supporting her. And now, when her fantasy was crumbling, she wanted to come crawling back? "No, Julia," he said quietly. "You don't love me. You love the idea of not losing me. And unfortunately for you, that ship has sailed." More silence. A few sniffles. Then a final, broken, "I'm sorry." David didn't respond. He simply hung up. The fallout wasn't just hitting Julia. It was hitting Eric too. David didn't have to do anything to ruin him. The whispers were already spreading. People in the theater world were quick to turn on those they deemed untrustworthy, and a director who took advantage of his position? It wasn't exactly a good look. Within days, David heard that a few actors had dropped out of Eric's next project. Someone had reported the unprofessional conduct to the theater board. Whether anything would come of it, David didn't know, but Eric had built his career on charm and trust, and now that trust was fractured. He wondered if Julia had realized yet, Eric wasn't going to be her grand love story. David sat on his porch that evening, a quiet sense of peace washing over him. The betrayal still stung, but there was something empowering in knowing he had walked away with his dignity intact. He had seen men in his position spiral, consumed with rage, making desperate attempts to win back someone who had already chosen to betray them. But David wasn't that man. Julia had made her choice, and now she had to live with it. For the first time in a long time, David felt something he hadn't expected: freedom. She had spent months playing a role, weaving a web of deception, but the stage lights had gone out. And David? He was already writing his next chapter. David sat in his half-empty home, the silence pressing in around him like a weighted blanket. Julia had come by earlier to collect the last of her things, moving with a subdued air, her usual confidence nowhere to be found. She hadn't looked him in the eye. Maybe she was too ashamed. Maybe she knew that there was nothing left to say. He watched from the window as she loaded the last of her boxes into her car, hesitating for a moment before glancing back at the house they had built together. She lingered, as if expecting him to come out, to call her back, to tell her that they could somehow fix this. But David didn't move. A few minutes later, she was gone. He let out a slow breath, running a hand through his hair. It was strange. After everything, after the lies, the betrayal, the humiliation, he didn't feel broken. He had spent weeks dreading the moment when the truth would finally come to light, fearing how it would unravel him. But the moment had come and gone, and he was still standing. He didn't bother checking in on Julia after she left. He didn't need to. Word had already spread through their mutual friends. She had moved into a small apartment across town. Not quite the grand romantic escape she had imagined. Eric, the man she had risked everything for, hadn't welcomed her with open arms. In fact, the moment her reputation took a hit, he had distanced himself, brushing off their involvement as nothing more than a misunderstood, professional relationship. David smirked at the irony. She had thrown away their marriage for a man who had never intended to catch her. It was poetic justice. Mutual friends who had once been charmed by Julia's enthusiasm for the theater now spoke about her in hushed, pitying tones. She wasn't the brilliant rising star anymore. She was the woman who had lied, who had been caught, who had tried to build something on deception and watched it collapse. And Eric? His reputation had taken a hit as well. The whispers of favoritism, of inappropriate relationships with his actresses, had stuck to him like glue. People were starting to look at him differently. The theater board had quietly removed him from an upcoming production. His charm could only carry him so far, and now he was learning the limits of it. David, on the other hand, was finally breathing again. He wasn't just existing, he was living. He went back to the things he had neglected while being consumed by doubt. He reconnected with old friends, went out to dinner without checking his phone every few minutes, stopped second-guessing every conversation he had with Julia. He even picked up an old hobby, woodworking, something he had abandoned when life got too busy. One afternoon, as he was sanding down a new project in his garage, his phone buzzed. It was a message from an old friend, Sarah. "I heard about everything. I just wanted to say, you handled it with a lot of dignity. If you ever feel like getting out of the house, let me know. No pressure." David stared at the message for a moment, then smiled. He wasn't ready to jump into anything new, but the idea of sitting across from someone who wasn't feeding him lies? That sounded nice. Maybe he'd take her up on it. As the weeks passed, David found himself thinking about Julia less and less. The pain dulled, the betrayal lost its sting, and what was left was nothing but the memory of a woman who had played a role for too long and lost herself in the process. He didn't hate her. He didn't love her. He just didn't care anymore. She had taken her final bow, and David? He was walking off the stage, ready for the next act of his life.